Let's go back to April 2, 2025. Washington celebrated its so-called Liberation Day by imposing new tariffs on foreign goods. The starting signal, we can say, for an America First trade war. Meanwhile, the fighting in Ukraine grinds on and the Middle East sinks deeper into violence. We can all see, feel and hear that the world is changing at the moment, from unipolarity to multipolarity. An order that might be less rules-based and more transactional. For small states like Switzerland, the question arises, how do you stay afloat in a sea where the powers collide? That's exactly what we are going to look at today in this video. And I think it might be really useful to go back in history and look at history and how in the past Switzerland dealt with the changing order in which it found itself and then draw the lessons for the present. So in 1515, let's go back to this year in Mariano, a Swiss army of 20,000 was cut down by the troops of Francis I. A year later, the Swiss signed the Ewige Friede, the eternal peace treaty with France. 2 centuries on, at the Congress of Vienna in 1815, Switzerland re-emerged as a corridor and buffer. Its independence, so to say, guaranteed by, of course, diplomacy, but also by geography, by its position within the different powers at that time in the heart of Europe. In 1848, the newly founded federal state, Switzerland, the Swiss Confederation, anchored its foreign policy in permanent armed neutrality. But we need to understand neutrality was never a single creed. It shifted with the times, differential under the League of Nations, integral in 1938, then Swiss Foreign Minister Max Petitpierre's neutrality and solidarity after 1945. Switzerland even monitored the Korean armistice in 1953, a quiet but early gesture of what came to be called active neutrality. As one former Swiss defense minister put it, and I am quoting him here, Swiss presence in the DMZ demonstrates that Switzerland is recognized as a neutral and impartial intermediary. It's an important signal, end of quote. After the Cold War, the pattern continued. The 1993 Neutrality Report stated that neutrality and international cooperation were compatible, a position that opened then the door to the Partnership for Peace with NATO and institutions such as the Geneva Centers. And now, as Europe rearms, neutrality is once again contested. Former US Ambassador to Switzerland, Scott Miller, captured the dilemma in 2023 when he said that NATO is like a donut and Switzerland is the hole in the middle. End of quote here. This image captures a perception and not the reality, because we have to understand that Swiss decision-making is sometimes slow but rooted in federalism and consensus. Decisions are not centralized and broad public debate is built into the process. And nowhere is this more evident than in the endless quarrel over neutrality, for example. In June this year, the Swiss Council of States once again found itself debating the Swiss People's Party's initiative, an attempt to carve neutrality into the constitution by spelling out 4 supposedly eternal principles. One of them is armed neutrality, then we would have no membership of military alliances, no sanctions except by UN resolution, and Switzerland's explicit role as a peace broker. The Federal Council and the Council of States reject this proposal. And I think rightly so, because neutrality was never meant to be a dogma carved in stone, but a tool, flexible, pragmatic, and always tied to the interests of the Swiss state. Foreign observers often point to the polls. More than 90% of Swiss citizens say they support neutrality. So that's one outcome of this polling. I think it's done yearly by the ETH Zurich. It's a staggering figure until you notice the contradiction. Over half also want closer ties with NATO, and a third would join the alliance outright. Neutral, but in what sense of the word? That's the question. There are concepts such as integral, differential, active, and since 2022, cooperative neutrality. In all of these concepts, two aspects of Swiss neutrality stand out. That concept is neutrality law, which obliges Switzerland not to participate in wars, not to supply weapons, and not to join any alliance with mutual assistance obligations. Then we have neutrality policy, the concrete behavior with which Switzerland makes its neutrality credible through clear communication, peace promotion, and restraint. Neutrality, that's also important to understand, does not mean indifference. Switzerland can and must call out violations of international law, as it did when Russia, for example, launched its war against Ukraine. Which, by the way, has opened a national debate here in Switzerland over what Swiss neutrality should mean in practice. And that's what we are going to look at next. On 23rd February 2022, the Federal Council condemned the build-up of Russian troops on Ukraine's border. The day after the invasion, it went halfway in adopting only parts of the EU's sanctions. And then, under pressure on 28 February, it fully aligned with Brussels. The sequence tells its own story, in my opinion. Condemnation, hesitation, then compliance. The reasons were obvious enough. Tens of thousands of Swiss citizens flooded the streets in the largest peace rally since 2003. Swiss politicians such as Gerhard Pfister and Thierry Burkhardt lambasted the government's caution. And from the outside came the pressure. EU Ambassador Petros Mavromichalis, US Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman, all urging Switzerland to pick a side and adopt the EU sanctions. Confronted with this dual pressure, the Federal Council of Switzerland shifted course. Or as former US President Biden put it, even Switzerland is inflicting pain on Russia and supporting the people of Ukraine. End of quote. But Swiss sanctions policy was not born in 2022. During the Yugoslav wars and on other occasions, Switzerland had already aligned itself with the European Union. What changed in 2022 was the perception. For the first time in decades, a public debate erupted. Can Switzerland still be neutral? And what is this neutrality? Federal Councillor Ignazio Gassis reached for a new label here, cooperative neutrality. In his telling, neutrality does not mean indifference. It includes taking sides, military but not politically. Hardly a revolution, I would say, in Swiss policy, but the mere phrasing was enough to ignite headlines and controversy. The battle lines were drawn. Swiss politician Christoph Blocher thundered that sanctions meant Switzerland had abandoned neutrality and joined the war. Former Federal Councillor Adolf Ogi, by contrast, insisted that Switzerland can no longer hide behind neutrality. Switzerland must uphold this principle and yet make it clear that the country stands on the side of human rights. And so the quarrel continues. The SVP's neutrality initiative seeks to drag the country back to a stricter frozen model of neutrality. But that would be a profound mistake, as I already mentioned, because neutrality has never been a creed chiseled in stone. It has always been a tool, flexible, pragmatic, designed as a tool of statecraft, we can say. And it has never meant moral indifference, as Ignazio Gassis put it at Davos in 2022, quoting him here. In principle, there is no neutral stance toward the brutal violation of fundamental values. End of quote. And by the way, the Swiss Federal Council government still operates within the framework set out in the 1993 Neutrality Report, which is a document that explicitly allows for flexibility when it comes to neutrality. This has been reaffirmed by the Swiss government 2 years ago. I think it is precisely this flexibility that enables Switzerland to play a constructive role in Europe's security architecture or security order. Far from abandoning neutrality, such engagement is a way of protecting Swiss interests. Switzerland has joined EU security policy programs. As I argued in an article for 4 Hours, neutrality should not be seen as a barrier to cooperation. The proof is tangible. On 21st August 2024, the Federal Council agreed to join projects under the EU's Permanent Structured Cooperation, in short PESCO. There, Switzerland joined the Military Mobility Project to ease the movement of troops and military equipment across Europe, and the Cyber Range Federation, strengthening resilience against cyber threats. Neutral, yes, but engaged as well, and more secure for it. Switzerland has also signed on to the European Sky Shield initiative, which is a new air defense project within the European Union. Yet its participation comes without any mutual assistance obligations, which keeps the engagement fully compatible with the principles of Swiss neutrality. Such growing involvement in Europe's defense has spilled into the domestic debate. Fabian Molina, a member of the National Council, has put forward, for example, a motion calling for Switzerland to go further, a formal security and defense agreement with the EU, modeled on Norway. The logic is simple enough: to reduce dependence on the United States and tie Switzerland more closely to Europe. This is not entirely new ground. Switzerland has long worked, for example, with NATO through the Partnership for Peace, the PFP in short, which is a framework that allows neutral states like Austria, Ireland and Switzerland to cooperate in areas of clear security benefit. In practice, this has meant Swiss participation in peace missions such as KFOR in Kosovo and countless training programs at the Geneva Center for Security Policy. But there is another layer, and that is cooperative security. In 2026, so next year, Switzerland will hold the chairmanship of the OSCE. The weight of that role will depend on what the war in Ukraine looks like by then. Will there be talks of ceasefires, monitoring missions and reconstruction? Or will the conflict simply grind on, the front lines moving a few kilometers at a time? That's the question. But the OSCE is a relevant organization, or it was more relevant in the past, we have to say, because it is one of the very few institutions in which Russia still has a seat. That alone makes it a potential stage for future negotiations, being very cautious here. For Switzerland, the task is clear: to make deliberate use of its diplomatic tradition and technical expertise. Switzerland is part of the European security architecture, that's clear. It assumes responsibility, but without any obligation to march to war. Security in the 21st century does not mean isolation. The réduit mentality belongs to another age. Today, safety comes from deterrence and dialogue, from coordination with European partners and also from the willingness to stand together in Europe. But credible security policy does not grow in government corridors alone. It depends on the support and the conviction of the public as well. Yes, the costs of rearmament are high, but the values at stake, democracy, freedom, human rights, are worth defending. And diplomacy must remain part of that defense. Neutrality, after all, is not an end in itself, but an instrument. Switzerland will not be judged by how often it repeats the word neutrality, but by how useful it deploys it. The seas ahead, we can say, may indeed be rough, yet history shows that with adaptability and a clear sense of purpose, even a small vessel can cut through storms and sometimes chart the way for others. And history also reminds us of something else. The INF Treaty showed that even bitter rivals can step back from the brink. The real question now: can Europe find a similar path to end the war in Ukraine. Click here to learn more. See you there.